look, I think it's a complicated picture overall, but on this particular question, and overall, I feel like there's more support for Donald Trump's positions than is comically acknowledged. Oppose Iran getting a nuclear weapon. I mean, look at this. 79% of adults agree on that. They agree with Donald Trump. Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon. 83% of Republicans, 79% of independents, 79% of Democrats. When you get 79% of Democrats and 83% of Republicans agreeing on anything, you know that that position is the very clear majority in this country. And so the American public is with Donald Trump. They definitely oppose Iran getting nuclear weapons.
So this is a nuance here, but, Trump and Netanyahu both arguing that Iran is close to being capable of making a nuclear weapon. If that is the case, what is the feeling of Americans as to whether the United States should get involved in this conflict?
Right. If you buy Donald Trump's theory of the case, and I think that's important to note, this is polling from April. If Iran's trying to make a nuclear weapon, look at this. Overall, you get the slight plurality. I mean, it's within the margin of error, but the slight plurality of Americans actually favor U.S. airstrikes compared to 47% opposing it. Now, here's the other nugget I'll note, right? There's been a lot of talk online and on social media and in podcasts of a divide within the Republican ranks. But here on this question, if Iran's trying to make a nuclear weapon, look at that. 69% of Republicans, the clear vast majority of Republicans, favor U.S. airstrikes on Iran, on their nuclear facilities. But there is this substantial minority, 27%, who oppose such an idea. So it's not surprising you're hearing those other voices besides Donald Trump out there. There are plenty of them in the Republican ranks who oppose the U.S. striking Iran if they're trying to make a nuclear weapon. But the clear majority of Republicans are with Donald Trump if, in fact, Iran is trying to make nuclear weapons. They do, in fact, potentially favor U.S. airstrikes.
Do Americans prefer a sort of military action here or a diplomatic solution when it comes to Iran?
Right. So, we're talking about you can favor one thing, but you could also favor another thing more. So, yes, the U.S. public plurality and the vast majority of Republicans would favor U.S. airstrikes if Iran's trying to make a nuclear weapon. But what do they prefer? To limit the risk of Iran making nuclear weapons, the American public prefers what? They prefer a negotiated agreement. 69% of the American public prefer a negotiated agreement as compared to 14% who prefer taking military action. I will note, Sarah Seidner, that this 69% includes 64% of Republicans. So even if Republicans, the clear majority, would in fact support airstrikes on Iran, U.S. airstrikes on Iran, they prefer a negotiated agreement.
And you've looked across the board, but we do need to mention that this was in May of 2025 that this polling was taken. We are now well into June, and these strikes are happening, and the United States is being sort of asked to come into the war by Israel.
We have polling now. We'll see where this polling takes as the political sides make their arguments.
All right, President Donald Trump and the United States government are going to have to make some big decisions with concern to Iran. But I think it's important to note that the Republican base of now versus yesteryear is considerably more dovish. It's considerably more dovish. What am I talking about here? Well, let's take a look at this question. To limit the risk of Iran making nuclear arms. This is among Republicans and what they prefer. You can see only about a quarter prefer military action to actually limit the risk of Iran making nuclear arms. But what takes the cake? Well, you see here, 2/3 of Republicans say a negotiated agreement. 64% of Republicans prefer this option to limit the risk of Iran making nuclear arms. Now, of course, Donald Trump has argued that Iran is, quote unquote, or was, quote unquote, very close to making a nuclear weapon. Well, in that particular case, how do Republicans feel? I think it's important to note that 69% of Republicans actually would be okay, would support airstrikes if Iran's trying to make a nuclear weapon. But here's what's important to note. Even in this case, more Republicans prefer diplomacy as an option, among Republicans. Now, of course, there is one hypothetical that's floating out there, and I think it's important to put it to bed, at least with concern to American support for it. It's a big no-no, and that is the idea of sending in U.S. ground troops. If Iran's trying to make a nuclear weapon, U.S. ground troops to stop Iran, this is a big loser. You can see it here. 60% oppose the idea of sending in U.S. ground troops to destroy nuclear facilities in Iran, compared to only 35% of Americans who support that idea. But again, President Donald Trump is going to make a case, potentially the American people, on what exactly the United States will in fact do with Iran. We'll wait and see whether these numbers change. But at this particular point, you can see it's quite an interesting and somewhat complex picture.
Well, listen, President Trump throughout this conflict has been fantastic. I spoke to the president on Sunday and just told him, I said, your leadership has been so critical on this. And he made clear Iran is not getting a nuclear weapon, and he is standing with Israel. I believe our position should be we stand unequivocally with the state of Israel. And I'll make a point. Israel is doing an enormous favor to the United States right now. I believe the most acute near-term security threat facing America is the threat of a nuclear Iran, because the Ayatollah is a religious nutcase. He is a theocratic mass murderer, and when he chants death to America and death to Israel, he does so in front of mobs of people.
Tom Massie is a Republican from Kentucky. He has joined several Democrats saying this is not our war. Even if it were, Congress must decide such matters according to our Constitution. Should we get further involved today?
Thomas Massie is on the wrong side of this, and I think that's very clear. We are in a defensive posture right now. The president is making the right decisions. Why? Because, Bill, we have to protect U.S. assets and obviously our personnel. We got 40,000 U.S. service members stationed in the region over there. That is what the president is doing. He's fully within his authority to act in that manner, and that is what the commander-in-chief is supposed to do. We have to stand by our ally Israel. They're our closest ally and friend, the only stable democracy in the region, and we have to make sure that they can do the job they need to do to protect their citizenry. Iran